The cockroach is one of the most resilient creatures on Earth. This tiny insect has survived for millions of years, through dramatic changes in the environment and countless challenges that wiped out many other species. But what makes the cockroach so difficult to defeat? For starters, it can survive for a remarkably long time without food. Depending on the species and conditions, some cockroaches can go for weeks, and in some cases even months, without eating. Water is another story, but even there, the cockroach can survive far longer than you might expect. And this is only the beginning, because when it comes to survival, the cockroach has abilities that sound almost impossible. It can survive injuries that would instantly kill a human. And there is one particular fact about this insect that sounds unbelievable. Even without its head, a cockroach can remain alive for days. But before we talk about how a cockroach can survive without its head, there is something even more fascinating about this tiny creature. Cockroaches have been around for an incredibly long time. They appeared on Earth long before humans, and over millions of years, they have lived through enormous changes in the planet's environment. Temperatures changed, habitats disappeared, entire species vanished. Yet cockroaches continue to survive and adapt. And that is one of the reasons they are considered such resilient insects. But surviving for millions of years is one thing. Surviving when there is nothing to eat is something completely different. A cockroach can slow down its activity when food becomes scarce, allowing its body to conserve energy and keep going for a surprisingly long time. Imagine going weeks without a meal. For a human, that would be extremely dangerous. For a cockroach, survival mode is simply part of its biology. But food is not the only challenge. Because when it comes to water, this little insect has another remarkable advantage. Now let's talk about something every living creature needs to survive: food and water. A human being cannot simply stop eating and drinking for a long time without serious consequences. But cockroaches are built differently. Depending on the species and the surrounding conditions, a cockroach can survive for weeks, and sometimes even months, without food. Its body can slow down its activity and conserve energy, allowing it to survive when food is difficult to find. But water is much more important. Without enough water, even a cockroach will eventually die. Still, some cockroaches can survive for weeks without drinking, especially when the environment provides enough moisture. And there is something even more interesting. Cockroaches are not simply waiting for food to appear. They can search for food and water in places where many other creatures would struggle to survive. Dark corners, cracks, drains, abandoned buildings. They can move through environments that seem completely unsuitable for life. But none of this compares to what happens when the cockroach loses something much more important: its head. What happens if a cockroach loses its head? For a human, the answer is obvious. But a cockroach can remain alive for several days after losing its head. In some cases, it can survive for around a week. And the reason is completely different from what happens in humans. Cockroaches do not breathe through their mouths or noses. They breathe through tiny openings along the sides of their bodies, called spiracles. So even without a head, the body can continue taking in oxygen. And there is another reason. The cockroach's brain is not responsible for controlling every function of its body in the same way a human brain is. Its nervous system is distributed throughout its body, allowing some basic functions to continue even after a devastating injury. But there is a problem. The cockroach eventually dies not simply because it has no head, but because it can no longer drink or eat normally. Eventually, dehydration takes over. Think about that for a moment. A creature can lose its head and still continue living for days. But this is not even the most extreme thing a cockroach can survive. Because there is another force that humans fear far more: radiation. Its body is surprisingly resistant to physical forces. Imagine placing a human and a cockroach in an environment where the forces become hundreds of times stronger than normal. The human body has strict limits. The brain, blood vessels, organs, and bones can all be affected by extreme acceleration and pressure. But a cockroach has a completely different body structure. It is small, lightweight, and protected by a tough outer skeleton. That tiny body can distribute physical forces across its structure in a way that gives it an advantage in situations that would be extremely dangerous for a human. This is one reason size matters so much in survival. The smaller the body, the less force it experiences from its own mass during sudden acceleration. And the cockroach has another advantage. Its body is flexible enough to withstand impacts that could seriously injure a much larger animal. So when you look at a cockroach running across your floor, you are not just looking at a small insect. You are looking at a creature whose entire body is designed for survival. But there is still one final test. A force that cannot be seen, cannot be heard, and can affect living cells without warning. Humans are extremely sensitive to high levels of radiation. A sufficiently large dose can damage cells, destroy tissues, and become fatal. But cockroaches can tolerate much higher levels of radiation than humans. This does not mean that a cockroach can simply walk through a nuclear explosion and survive. The heat, shockwave, and extreme energy near the center of an explosion would destroy almost any living creature. But far from the center, where the immediate blast is no longer the main danger, radiation becomes an important part of the story. And this is where the cockroach has a remarkable advantage. Experiments have shown that some cockroaches can survive radiation doses that would be devastating to humans. Their cells are more resistant to radiation damage, and their bodies can tolerate levels of exposure that would be extremely dangerous for us. Think about that. The same tiny insect you might try to crush with a shoe can withstand radiation that could seriously harm a human being. And this is why the cockroach became part of one of the most famous stories surrounding nuclear disasters. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The atomic bombs dropped by the United States in 1945 created unimaginable levels of heat, pressure, and radiation. Cockroaches near the center of such destruction would not survive. But those far enough away from the immediate devastation could have a much greater chance of surviving the radiation than humans. And that leads to the strangest question of all. What exactly makes this tiny creature so resistant? But maybe the strangest thing about the cockroach isn't everything it can survive. It's the question we still haven't answered. What makes this tiny creature so incredibly resistant? How can an insect that is so small survive conditions that can be deadly to a human? We've seen it survive long periods without food, continue living for days without its head, withstand extreme physical conditions, and tolerate levels of radiation far beyond what a human can handle. And yet, there is still something about the cockroach that makes scientists fascinated by this creature. Maybe the answer is hidden somewhere inside its incredible biology. But what do you think? Leave your theory in the comments, because sometimes the smallest creatures can hide the biggest mysteries.